everybody. My name is Rebecca Grace and I am a Squarespace expert and website designer, and I'm also the creator of the Encyclopedia of Code, which helps non-coders or beginner coders use code on their Squarespace website. And today we are going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of coding in Squarespace. And I have 6 do's and don'ts for you and to help you make sure that your code is nice and organized and that you have less errors, less time debugging in your code. So CSS is usually the first coding language that Squarespace designers dive into when they're looking at dipping their toe into code and trying it out for the first time. And this is for a pretty good reason. It's I find one of the easier languages to kind of read as you go through. Some of the other ones can be a little bit harder to understand or have more lingo that's particular to that language, where CSS is a little bit more like English and easier to kind of read through as you go. It also has a structure that is quite set and similar as you go through the code. So there's not a bunch of different variations. So it's a little bit easier to kind of pick up and edit. Okay, so we're going to be talking about 6 do's and don'ts of coding in Squarespace, starting with Number 1, the order of your CSS is very important. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, meaning that as it reads from top to bottom, the code underneath will override the code above it. So if we go to Design, Custom CSS, and let's say here I've set a block to have red. If underneath of this, I then set this to blue, it is going to ignore the code above it and read the code below it. And so you need to be careful with how you're organizing your code in here so that you don't end up with unnecessary code. Let's imagine that there's a whole bunch of code in between these two and I can't see this, and later on I'm like, actually I want it to be green, and nothing happens. And you're like, my code's not working, why isn't it working? And it's because you have this other code way below it. And so it's very important you're keeping your code organized. I tend to like to have the code for the header at the top and then the code for the pages kind of grouped together underneath that, and then my code for my footer at the bottom. So I've written some CSS here, and we're going to go through and clean this up to show you how you can have more effective CSS. But before I start organizing this, you can see there's a lot of block IDs in here, which makes it very, very hard to know what this code is for and what it does, which leads to number 2, always use comments to keep track of your work. So comments are little notes you can leave for yourself. With CSS, I like to do a /* and then */. And whatever I write between these 2 stars, you'll see it kind of takes a light gray color. And this is just a note for you. It doesn't read it as code. So I can write something like take action image title. You know, something that I know exactly what that's going to be. I might even write something like on homepage. So I want to be very specific, so later on as I'm looking at this, I know what this is for, especially because I've used a block ID here. Okay, so let's go through the rest of this. This is also the image title on the homepage, so I'm going to get rid of that because it's unnecessary. This one, you can see it's very hard with the block ID knowing where it comes from, but as I just wrote this, I can kind of tell, but I'm looking. Yeah, so this is, let's say, my tagline in section 2 on homepage. And this is for the title in the header of the homepage. And this is for the links in my footer. Okay, so now I've put little comments in so I know what all of these are for, and I'm going to reorder them. I don't have any code for the header yet, so my navigation, but I do have the header title. I think that should go first for my home page. So I'm going to move my footer code to the really bottom, And then I'm putting it in order as it goes down the page. So the header title, then this tagline, then this code, and then my footer. So you can see it's nice and organized. And if I go back later on to edit this, I know approximately where it's going to be in my CSS box here, as well as I know I have a note that I can search for as I'm going through. My third one is don't repeat yourself, DRY, don't repeat yourself. So if you have code that is achieving the same thing, you don't want duplicates. So you can see here I have a bunch of color reds, maybe I want this red as well. And so I have all of these different things that all just say red. Right? And so I might want to combine those together so that I'm not repeating myself over and over. Okay, and actually if I look at this code, these are all of the H3s on this home page. And so I might decide not to use a block ID at all. I might want to be a little bit less specific, or I can put a comma and put my other selector there. And now these 3 lines of code are the same as everything I had before, and I still have all of the things red here. Right? I might even combine this one. And then I can remove this line here. Okay? So that I have all of this sort of combined together. So now I can change this line to say red text on the home page. So I still have a note for myself, but now I have added all of those things that I want read together. Okay. Now you'll notice as I moved this turned blue, and that's because I had added an important tag on here. I saw that when I tried to change this was still staying blue. I couldn't figure it out. So I said, I'm just gonna add the important tag on there. Now it's red, perfect. But this leads to tip number 4, avoid the important tag. This important tag, what it does is it makes this line of code the priority. And so it's overriding code that's placed above it. And so essentially I'm overriding or having twice the amount of code that I need in order to change this red. And so I want to be careful that I'm not having more code than I need, right? That's why I got rid of duplicates. So if I'm having to place this important tag here, I want to make sure that it's because I'm overriding Squarespace's original setting and not code that I've written for myself. So in an ideal world, if I was writing all of the code for this website, I wouldn't really need important tags because I would just change the code that I'd written above. We can't access the original CSS script for our website, so sometimes we have to use this important tag in order to override something Squarespace had set. So for example, I wanted to remove the underline from a link. So you'll notice I had an underline here. I wanted to remove that, so I used this code here. And in this case, I had to use the important tag in order to override Squarespace's setting, but it's not because I'm overriding code I wrote. I know that I didn't have any other code to do with the links in the footer, and so in this case, using the important tag is okay. But in this case here, I'm actually overriding code I have written. You can't see it here, and this is because I haven't kept all my CSS in the same place, which leads us to tip number 5. You want to keep your CSS all in one space so that you can make sure you're not duplicating or overriding your own code. I have sometimes seen people use or add styles into the code injection. I've seen people use it on pages. I've seen people use inline CSS, which is what I've done here. So if I go into this website and go into this box, I have written it inside of a code block to style it blue. And so when I'm in the CSS box and I want to make it red, it's not working. I have to add an important tag. But I'm overriding code I've written, and I couldn't see that because I haven't added it all in the same place. So instead of adding it here, I want to make sure that I'm adding it in the same place as the rest of my code so that I know that I don't have any duplicates. And now I don't need this important tag in order to make it red. There are exceptions to that rule. If I'm adding some code to hide the header or footer of a page, then I'll do that on a specific page. But for the most part, you want to make sure all your CSS is in one spot so that it's all in the proper order, that you're not having any duplicates, and you can keep track of exactly what code you have. My last tidbit, number 6, is to be careful where you find your code. There are so many great places to find code on blogs, on YouTube channels like this, in the Squarespace forum. But those developers don't know what other code you have on your site. When I create a blog, I don't know what other code you have. If the code that I'm writing is going to clash, I do my best to make sure that the code I'm writing would be beneficial to as many people as possible. I'm very careful with how I choose my selectors and write my code. But you still have to evaluate the code you're putting on your site. You need to make sure you're putting it in the proper order. You need to make sure you're adding comments and all of that stuff. And if you're copying and pasting from somewhere else, they're not necessarily going to do that or have those instructions for you. So be very careful and mindful that where you're getting your code is a good source, and then also putting in that extra time to make sure that when you're putting it on your site that you're doing it properly, following all of these do's and don'ts that I've laid out for you. So because of this, I do suggest you be very careful of code editors or programs that generate code for you, because they most likely cannot read the other code you have on your site. They might not be placing it into the right places. They could be putting it on the page or in the code injection rather than the custom CSS box and so on. And this can really bulk up how much code you have on your site, the duplicates you have on your site, and therefore you're opening yourself up to more errors and more chances of sitting there for hours and hours trying to debug your code, figuring out where everything is. So just be very careful of where you get your code, and make sure that any code you put on your site, you're following these do's and don'ts. So again, just to reiterate, make sure you're ordering it properly. I like to have the header at the top, then go by pages, and then the footer at the bottom. Always use comments to keep track of your work. There's nothing worse than going into a site and just seeing a whole bunch of block IDs and having no idea where they came from. So make sure you are putting comments in your work. Don't repeat yourself. Combine things as much as possible. Avoid the use of the important tag unless you know you're overriding something in Squarespace that you cannot do in the style editor, and you know you're having to use the important tag, then that's okay. Otherwise, make sure you're not overriding your own code. So avoid the important tag if possible. Keep all your CSS in one place so you can keep track of, make sure it's nice and organized, and then just make sure that you're careful of where you're finding your code, so that it's coming from a good place, and still keeping track as you paste it in of all of the other do's and don'ts. So if you like this tutorial, make sure you like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, or sign up for the freebie in the footer of my blog so that you can be notified when another tutorial is posted. Until then, that is 6 do's and don'ts of using CSS in Squarespace.